All right, it is 1:55, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the SNRE Graduate Seminar. Um, we're going to do something a little different today. I'm going to be presenting, and I am going to be presenting on presenting. So hopefully it'll be fun for everyone. And welcome for those joining us on YouTube as well. Let's go ahead and get started. So I want to just do a plug. Dr. Jana Hilsenroth asked me to talk about this IFAS meditation study that's happening, which offers free access to a meditation app for 4 months. They're trying to recruit 200 students. They're currently at 100. The due date is tomorrow, but you can get in through the week. You can email Dr. Kelly Grogan, or I just dropped in the Zoom chat a Qualtrics form that you can fill out if you're interested. So check that out. So today, what we're going to do is talk about presenting. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and why I am interested in this. This is actually something I've been thinking about for a long time. So I'm excited to present this to you guys today and to hear your feedback on it. So I'll start with my background. We're going to talk about storytelling and why people love stories. And I am going to open it up for a short discussion. So be thinking now on what it is about stories and storytelling that interests you. And it would be great if you would share. We'll talk about elements of a narrative story. So breaking it down, what makes a story, and then we're going to apply some of these storytelling ideas to research presentations, and I'm going to give some tips with each of those applications to show you some examples. So that is the plan. So this is me. On the left here is little me in that awesome 80s sweater. I'm from a little town called Yulee, Florida, which is in the very northeast corner of the state. That's my sister in the back, Ida. And we are on our sailboat off the coast of Amelia Island near Fort Clinch. And so I grew up outside, spending a lot of time on the water, and that obviously influenced who I am and what I care about today. And I have an interdisciplinary background and sort of two career paths that I am straddling simultaneously. So you can see from my education here, definitely interdisciplinary. So every degree, I sort of picked a different topic. My bachelor's is in psychology from New College of Florida. My master's is in mass communications from the University of Florida. And my PhD is from SNRE. And I am a social scientist and looked at the human dimensions of oyster management in the Gulf of Mexico for my PhD research. And I did a lot of work with stakeholder communication and facilitation. And throughout that time, I've also been working as a professional journalist since 2010. I worked at several newspapers within Florida, and I've also worked as a freelance journalist. And in 2017, I co-founded an environmental journalism nonprofit with two other science journalists. So you can kind of see my education maybe makes a little bit more sense in that context. All of those degrees make sense to me. They all are social science degrees, and they all were looking at humans and their interaction with the environment. And so I really have an interest in kind of marrying natural resource management and communication and trying to make it as effective as possible. So that's kind of what this presentation is designed around, and hopefully it'll be at least somewhat effective. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Marjorie. This is the nonprofit started in 2017. And what we do is we write environmental stories. So we write in-depth investigative pieces about environmental topics in Florida. And we've done a variety of stories. I'm going to tell you about a few in a minute. And we have a tagline that is to reclaim Florida woman. So that is a response to the Florida Man news stories, which likely you have heard of. and are somewhat problematic in terms of how they portray Florida people. So that's one of our missions, is to kind of show a different side of people living in the state. But aside from that, we do a lot of in-depth journalism. And so we are not a breaking news organization, which means we do not have to, we're not on a super tight schedule like a typical newspaper would be. So we have the luxury of taking sometimes months to put out an issue. And what we have been doing for the past year or so is focusing on serial issues. So we'll do one topic that has several parts. And so you can see in these stories, some of them say part 2, well, they all say part 2, but yeah, so they're all part of a series. So I'll tell you a little bit about what these are, just to give you a sense of what we do in the Marjorie. So up at the top left is the Forgotten Storm, and that was a part of our series called Overlooked, which looked at impacts of Hurricane Michael on the Panhandle. And this story in particular looked at the timber industry and the impacts of that hurricane on the timber industry there. On the right, you see the story of Uno. And this is a story about a Florida panther who was found on the side of the road near death, had been shot in the face and the rump. And Uno was rehabilitated, though he was blind, and he an answer for the species about human-animal conflict and interaction. The bottom left is from our series called Hogtied, which is about feral hogs in the state. And this story in particular is about the environmental impacts of hogs as an invasive species. And then on the bottom right is from our series of Sugarcane Boiling Point, which is about pre-harvest sugarcane burns in South Florida. So the sort of conversation between farmers and public communities surrounding sugarcane farms, thinking that this is a public health issue. And so that tension is what we explored. And with many of these stories, we try to focus on what unites the people there on both sides rather than what divides them, while talking about the complexities of their perspectives. So that just gives you a sense of where I'm coming from and why I'm talking about storytelling. So I would love to hear from you. Why do you love stories? Maybe you don't love stories. I don't know. If you don't, tell me that too. But I would love for those in the Zoom, feel free to unmute your mic, or you can type in the chat, just some ideas on what makes stories interesting. Why do you like stories? So go ahead.
Yeah, we connect with people who have similar experiences.
So stories as a way to share kind of common ground.
Correct.
Yeah, to share common ground and to also share emotional connections. If you feel a certain way about a certain topic, that story will get your attention quicker.
That's great. Yeah, so sharing emotional experiences that as well, and that's something I'm going to touch on in a minute. It looks like we have a chat from Brandon. They can provide insights into other ways of life as well. And if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to type in the chat there. I can see the chat there as well.
I would say stories are, I like stories because they're a way to learn and play.
So what do you mean by play? Can you expand on that, Shane?
Just to be creative and to think about something from, like we're saying, other people's perspective, but a story giving a different layer from more creative perspective than that, removed from the people that are present.
Thank you, Shane. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's sort of a different goal that goes with storytelling, where it's not just passing on information, but you're like trying to have fun while you're doing it. You're entertaining people, maybe even yourself as the storyteller. It looks like Kat says, I love stories that marry natural history and fiction. For example, the work of Barbara Kingsolver, stories that serve as edutainment. Yes, love that word. And then another comment, stories are easier to follow than a complex scientific article. Yes, thank you. So that is kind of the key of why I'm interested in doing this presentation, because if you are a scientist that has spent a lot of time working on a topic, you want to share that information with someone. It can be difficult if you've been embedded in this world of scientific research to figure out how to best share that information where people are actually absorbing it. And so I think some of these things I'm going to present today can maybe help make your presentations accessible and maybe edutaining at best. So any other comments before we move forward? All right. So this is just some things I was thinking, why do we love stories? Well, they're familiar, right? When you are a kid, that's one of the first things you do socially is your parents read you a book before you go to bed. You're told stories by your family about family history, about things that have happened. They're a very common part of our social lives. They also give our thoughts structure. So stories have a structure to them that we understand inherently, right? There's a beginning, there's some stuff that happens in the middle, and there's usually a resolution. There's always going to be kind of an end. So it's a nice way to, like, a nice structure to use to organize your thoughts. Kind of the comment earlier touching on this, they help us feel invested. There's emotional components to stories. And they also are vessels for lessons. So a lot of stories contain information that's trying to get to you some way. So maybe it's, if it's a scientific kind of motivated story, then there could be like some data in it, but it could be a moral, it could be a social lesson. There's some kind of information usually in a story. Even if you think about like something you're watching on Netflix, typically there's some kind of moral lesson in those Netflix shows, or something that is being communicated. And they also help us escape, which can be very handy in times like now, where there's a lot of societal trauma happening, and it's hard to know just even how to get through the day. Plug again to the meditation study that you should all probably do that I talked about a minute ago. But I thought about, Tiger King. If any of you have seen that, it kind of blew up when Tiger King first was put on Netflix. And I think one reason for that was because it was, around the same time that we were all starting to be quarantined. So the timing was right, and it was extravagant enough to get people's attention. And it was an escape from this reality that we were being put in, that it was very confusing what was happening. We could all watch Tiger King together as a nation for a couple weeks, and at least we were thinking about something else. So that's one part of it. Not that, escapism is always a key, but when if you can transport someone to another place in your presentation, then you can engage them in a way where they'll stick with you for longer. So this is like, typically when you hear storytelling kind of presentations, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get some tips on how to do it. I'm going to give you kind of one slide that gives you some tips that I use as a journalist. And then we're going to kind of apply some of these things more specifically to scientific presentations. So when I'm writing a journalism story, in journalism, that's something that you do is you start with a hook. You want to hook people. And I think that's really applicable to any kind of communication. You want to keep people interested. So one way to do that is to start with a crucial moment. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something like outrageous or sensationalized, but it can be what you think is the most interesting thing. And it could be a tiny moment. It could be a description of something beautiful. It could be a character. Those are just some examples, but you want to start with something that got you interested, and so probably it'll interest other people. Don't be afraid of communicating specific details. So it's a little confusing because some of the things I'm going to be saying today are, you can ditch some of the details that aren't as interesting, but when it comes to details that help to provide something for the audience to grab onto, like a specific example, don't be afraid of including those. Describe what something looks like, describe how it smells. That's the next point, use imagery, use your senses to describe your experience. Connection to characters is a big one, just in general in storytelling. That's something at the Marjorie we think about a lot, is the sources that we used and how we can turn them, into multi-dimensional people that can help tell the story. And I'm going to present an argument in a minute on how you can kind of do that with your research as well. Pacing and suspense. So this is big, I think, in education as well, is you don't want to give everything away at once. You want to moderate how people get information. So that means just kind of presenting things one piece at a time. And then, maybe you're saving something for the end to keep people interested. And then alternating broccoli and ice cream cones. Have you guys heard of this before? Seeing some nods. So what this means is it's like you want to have the healthy bits that are like, I love broccoli, so it doesn't work that well, but the healthy bits that maybe people don't think are as delicious. And then you also want to have the little nuggets that everybody thinks is delicious. So it's, in this circumstance, it could be, alternating some scientific data with something more descriptive. You want to alternate these things so that there's a treat throughout for people to get through information. And a lot of times this is used with writing, but these skills can be applied to presentations as well. So I just wanted to put this in here to show that, I'm talking about storytelling. This is kind of like a craft, but there are science to back this up. So there's a lot of psychological research about storytelling, how it affects the brain, and that it is effective for a reason. And these are just a few of the reasons why. So one reason why is that there's a process called neural coupling, where when a story is told to a person, part of their brain is activated that allows the listener to really feel like it's their experience. So their brain is activating as if they were there, if you're effectively telling the story, if you're telling it well. Another thing that happens is mirroring. So listeners will match their brains to the neural activity of the speaker. So you're having this shared experience happening, which you could see there can be empathy grown from that, just greater connection. There's also a release of dopamine into a person's system if a story is told well, and that can help people remember things, remember details with greater accuracy. And then the last thing is that you're using more of your brain. If a story is told well, it's activating these different parts of the brain, like the motor cortex, sensory cortex, frontal cortex. And so you're having a more immersive experience by listening to a story rather than just like a bullet pointed list of facts. So here's a description of, a basic story. Here's what the structure of a story looks like. If you're structuring a narrative, you're going to set the scene. There's going to be some information that you need to start the story. Typically, a problem is going to arise. There's a rising action. There's a climax. That's where, the most tension in the story happens. Then a falling action and resolution. The story is resolved. So kind of as I was saying before, there's a lot of times a very specific structure that we understand that is related to storytelling. Not all stories look like this, but a lot of stories do. Generally, this is the format. So what I am proposing today is that you can apply this to your scientific research. So you sort of have an introduction, right? Similar to the exposition. The research questions, similar to a problem. Something arises in your mind as the scientist, that needs more information. Your methods are that rising action. The climax is the results. You're getting some evidence that you can actually figure out what's going on with the problem or the question. And then the discussion is explaining those results, and your resolution is the conclusion. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to kind of relate these structures. And so we're going to function in this way as I make this argument about scientific thinking and storytelling. And so there was, there's this Harvard psychologist who has said that scientific thinking is basically, he's described it as a way to know truth, and storytelling is a way to endow experience with meaning. So these are not mutually exclusive. There's definitely overlap. There is meaning in knowing truth. So I'm just a little philosophical sidebar there. So there are many elements to a story. What we just saw a minute ago was this general structure. I'm picking these 6 elements and I'm going to relate them to things that you may present on in scientific research. And so here's what it's going to look like. Your species or your phenomena become your characters. Your habitat or the context becomes the setting. Your study purpose or your research questions become the conflict in the story or the problem. The study methods become the plot. Your findings become the resolution, and your interpretation as a scientist becomes narration. So hopefully I haven't lost you guys yet. Hopefully this makes sense. So to do this, I'm going to use the Darwin Finch study as an example. And I'm doing that because most people know what this is. This is an interdisciplinary ecology program. But disclaimer, I am not an ornithologist. So there may be inaccuracies. This is just simply to provide an example on how you can, make it more storytelling-ish. So if you don't know about the Darwin Finch study, here's a little background so you're not completely lost. So Darwin went to the Galapagos. He collected some birds. He thought they were finches. They weren't actually finches, but they've been called finches throughout time. He found evidence of adaptation. So basically he found that these finches adapted to become separate species because they occupied different niches. So their bodies and their beaks changed to suit changes in their diet and those niches that they started to habitate. And then this became an important part of Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. So this is an extreme bird's eye view of the study. So with that in mind, let's talk about this. So you have species and phenomena. In this case, if you're Darwin, your species are the finches. And what I'm saying is that you can think of these when you're presenting as your characters. So what you want to do is you want to introduce your audience to them. Who are they? What's their deal? Why should we care about them? Tell us about them. Give us some details. You can describe what it's like to be one of these finches. And they could even be this beginning thread that can lead your audience through the story. So I've tried to do this because I realized I really need to show examples. So I'm using kind of the language to show what I mean here. And it's just showing an example of kind of standard scientific presentation language versus more storytelling language. So in this case, standard language could be, we assess the beak size of 13 species of Galapagos finches. There's nothing wrong with that. It's telling what the study is focused on. But a storytelling approach could be each of the 13 species of Galapagos finch use their beak in a unique way. The woodpecker finch, for example, has mastered tool use. These birds will use a twig, stick, or cactus spine to pick insects out of trees. So here you're giving the audience something to hold on to. You're telling them about the character. You're telling them what the character does, something unique about them, why you should care about them. So it's just some added detail there that can really go a long way in, all of those things we were talking about before, activating people's brains. So a habitat and context. That is, I think, not a very big stretch to think of that as like a setting. Setting the scene for a story. So if you're presenting on this, you want to set the scene. What is it like where they live? What's happening there? What's unique about it? Why are you telling us now? So, think of this as like your study area, for example. Instead of, focusing on the metrics of it, maybe you want to focus on the feeling of being there. And one example I have here is using imagery to do that. So standard language could be the Galapagos Islands are an archipelago of volcanic islands situated 563 miles west of continental Ecuador. These islands are known for their large number of endemic species. So there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's fine. But a more storytelling approach could be a dense fog blankets the 21 islands of the Galapagos archipelago. Though the isolated islands are blessed with temperatures in the 70s year-round, the many endemic species that live there experience frequent drizzles and a steady cold wind that blows from the southeast. So you have a little bit more information there, right? You have a sense, you can kind of feel it. You can feel the drizzle, you can feel the breeze, you can kind of sense it in a way where, just describing that it's, so many miles west of Ecuador doesn't necessarily do. I'm going to give kind of a disclaimer at the end, and I'll give it here now, which sometimes you need the details, and it depends on the audience. But if you have the luxury of being kind of more creative, as Shane was saying earlier, then there's some room there to paint a picture with your data and with your experience as the scientist, instead of just presenting kind of facts. So next we have study purpose, which could be also research questions. And I'm connecting that to the conflict in the story or the problem. So both of these inspire like a curiosity. They're a catalyst that makes the study happen, that makes the story happen. And a lot of times, they're spurred by a phenomena that needs greater explanation. There's some kind of change in a paradigm. There's a new way of thinking. And so what you can do is kind of illustrate why you're interested in this as the researcher. And you can also pace information. So this is what we were talking about before, where you can just present little pieces of information at a time, kind of like breadcrumbs, to help lead the audience through what you're trying to present. So standard language. The purpose of the study was to investigate the links of beak morphology with the diet and habitat of each species. Again, nothing wrong with it. Storytelling approach is just somewhat different. There's more details, and in this case, it's focused on pacing. So the large ground finch, which eats primarily nuts and seeds, has a large but short beak. The small tree finch uses its short curved beak to feed on insects. Our study investigates the link between beak shape and the type of food each species prefers. So with pacing here, you have one example, you have another example, and then there is the connection between those two examples. So some of these differences are quite subtle, but I'm really curious to hear if you guys are kind of seeing what I'm saying. So then study methods becomes plot. And this one, I think you can focus on how you investigated the phenomena, what was your process, what were the challenges? And the key here is to be detailed. You want to walk your audience through the process as much as you can. So use details that paint a picture. Standard language, in the methods section. A caliper was used to measure the upper margin of the beak from the tip of the beak to the base of the skull. This is in your research paper. You need to have those details. You need to be specific. With storytelling, I'm saying use details, but you want to kind of use different details. You want to use details that communicate how it was done. You want to paint a picture of how it was done. So from the tip of the base, each bird's beak was measured with the metal jaws of a caliper. This handheld instrument can be tightened to the closest millimeter. I mean, I don't use a caliper. I'm just like, I think that's what they do, but I'm pretty sure, this is how you paint the picture. Like if you want to communicate how you did your research, you need to tell people what a caliper is. You need to show them how you did the measurements that you did. And I think you can spend a little more time on the methods section really painting that picture to help people understand it. Because there's a lot of really interesting tools that everyone uniquely uses, and there's not a lot of overlap between those. And I think that there could be a lot of exchange of kind of appreciation for the process if you spend some extra time painting the picture of how you do the work you do. So then we have this idea of findings. So your study findings being the resolution of the story. So you had a question. So this is where all the stories of your data points come together. What is this? What is explaining the phenomena you're studying? And how does this affect your character? So for this, you can include an illustrative example. So sort of standard language would be, our findings suggest evidence of adaptive radiation. Like probably a lot of people, in this seminar know what that means. Depending on your audience, they may or may not know. But you can take this in a way where you're illustrating it, and then you can present this vocab word as well if you would like to, but you can also just describe what it means. It's that old kind of journalism or writing technique of show don't tell. So storytelling language would be, we found that each finch species adapted to its own specific niche. The large cactus finch was especially unique. Its long beak is especially adapted to feed on cactus, a common sight in the dry shrub where it lives. So it's sort of describing what adaptive radiation means with one example. And I know that some of this sounds like this storytelling, which can almost sound like a children's book, because it's pacing, it's one piece of information at a time. And this is an example, maybe too simplistic for your audience, but it's just sort of this idea that you take your time to paint a picture rather than cutting to the chase. So then this one, interpretation becomes the narration. This is obviously a reference. I think as, a scientist, you have to prove that you've bricked in your research, and sometimes including too much information about how you came, your frame or perspective can jeopardize that. But I think that audiences do want to see you as a human. They do want to know how you make sense of information, and you can spend some time talking about your experience, what observations meant to you, if you had confusions, if you had challenges, and you can describe new questions that have arisen for you. So an example of this, if you're Charles Darwin in this case, the differences observed suggest that each species evolved specific morphological differences suited to its habitat through a process called natural selection. So this is Darwin's standard language I'm proposing. More storytelling way Darwin could have said this is, after comparing the finches we collected, we were struck by how different each individual was from the next, and how uniquely they were each suited to their environment. We believe there may be an evolutionary process at work here, one which we call natural selection. So just to, the real difference between these two paragraphs is the injection of the first person, being like, I was there, I experienced it, this is what we experienced. And I think back to that idea of emotional connection, if you are putting yourself as a character in the story, that is another way to get people to be interested in your research, to be interested in your findings, in your own investment in the topic. So with all of that said, this is not always going to work. You can't take every narrative element and apply it to scientific research, or maybe you can, but I would say be cautious. And this is my list of things that, might be a little trickier. So for example, mood or tone, that's a narrative element that, can be tricky to use in a scientific way, because it's imbued with emotion. You don't want to present your study in a dark and brooding way, or overly optimistic and cheery from the outset, because you're trying to present data, you're trying to interpret it in a way that aligns with what's been found previously, and you don't want to make it too biased. So I would caution against that. I think personification as well, I'm saying to treat, think of your species as a character, but that doesn't mean think of your species as a character that has human emotions. And I think that in all writing, in journalism, in scientific writing, maybe not in children's books, but personification of animals is not accurate ever. So I would caution against that. Dialogue, if you're a qualitative researcher, you are probably presenting dialogue. But even in that case, I would just be careful using this in a narrative way, because you don't want to present something that like was said offhandedly in a way where it looks like it's representing, your study in a more generalized way. You just want to be careful using dialogue. Drama, you don't want to inject forced drama into your study, especially if it's a controversial issue. You don't want to look at it and try and increase the conflict between stakeholders, or, that's not what I'm proposing here at all. And then the last thing is flowery descriptions. So taking kind of too much time to set the scene, taking too much time to like overly describe things, there's a balance there. So, I'm suggesting you take some time, you describe things in a way where people can envision them, but you don't want to waste people's time by, just describing things because you like to hear your descriptions. So just be cautious with that. And then I think just to summarize, what I'm trying to say here are these takeaways. So you can simplify your research without losing what makes it interesting. You don't have to necessarily focus on all of the details of your analysis or of your study, because you might lose people. What you really want to illustrate why you're interested. There's something about your research that drew you to it, probably, and you want to communicate that with vivid description. Like maybe you're fascinated by what you're studying, and if you can like communicate that fascination, then you are going to get people interested in what you're doing. People want to hear about you, kind of what I was saying before. You're human. People want to hear your thoughts, your experiences, your confusion. It's worth taking a minute or two to talk about that, even if it's, 15-minute presentation at a conference, to just show that you had a process here, that you had a scientific process, but you may have had an emotional process. You may have had an intellectual process that changed the way you think about the world. You may have had a personal paradigm shift. It's worth spending some time on that. And there's more than one way to tell the story of your research. I think that's really what I'm pushing for here more than anything. It's kind of like framing. There's a lot of ways you can look at it, but you get to choose. You don't have to just stick to the format that has been presented to you, but you can think about it a little more creatively, and try and, pick out those frames that you think will be appealing to people. And then keeping people interested may be more valuable than communicating every detail. So I kind of said that with the first one. And then this is a very important disclaimer. This is not going to work for all your audiences. So if you're trying to get a job, if you are going to a conference and your goal is to prove how rigorous you were in your methods, or, show that you did this study that's like highly contested or something. Sometimes you need to get into the nitty-gritty details of your data, and there's just no way around that. Maybe you can inject an element or two of this to keep people interested, but sometimes you have to follow the traditional format just to prove that you're a serious professional. And so I just want to make sure, I'm not saying don't do that, but there are many circumstances where you can be more creative. And, this presentation is that for me. As a student in SNRE, I was constantly trying to craft my presentations in a way that were more storytelling focused, but I would often get pushback on that because I had to first prove that I was a serious, researcher, and that I could do it. I could follow the format and not just turn it into a story. But I think once you've passed that threshold, you can start to be more creative, and it really can help audiences care more about what you're doing. And I would just encourage, there's always a way to make your research more interesting. And so when you're looking at your presentations, just put that on your checklist. How accessible is the information? How engaging is it? And just make it part of your process. So that's my presentation for today. I am extremely curious what you guys think, and if you have any questions. That is my email, my Twitter tag, and that's the Marjorie's website. So I am happy to take any questions. We have about 10 minutes left, so plenty of time. Feel free to unmute your mic or type in the chat or YouTube box if you do have questions.
I'll ask the question, kind of touching on one of the cautions that you led us to, which is how do students or researchers know and be able to gauge on the type of presentation that they should give? For example, these seminar series, some can be very technical, some could be storytelling. How do we know when to use what when it's appropriate, but also because it does take some experimentation to find your storytelling abilities. So, can we really risk doing that at any point in our academic process of learning and publishing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I totally recognize it's like with all of the things that you have to do as a student, probably adding another thing on top of it is not, the best thing you want to hear. But I think there are times that you can, for instance, if you are invited to speak in a panel at a class, that's kind of a low risk scenario. You're speaking to students, then you could experiment with it at that time. I think you definitely always want to think about the audience. That's the most important thing. Who are you presenting to? And you want to look at what other kinds of presentations are being given, because you have to kind of fit in, and that's sometimes it can be in your favor if you don't, but if you're trying to get a job, it really is important to look like you're part of the field. So it depends on your goal, it depends on the audience, and it depends on what other types of presentations are being given, around the same time. I think you can go out of your way to look for low risk opportunities. And I'm hoping, as you move forward in your career, that creativity is something that you're kind of allowed to be more and more as a researcher, just because that's how you reach people, is to present things in new ways. Thank you for your question, Shane. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for listening to me today. If you do have some feedback on this, feel free to email me, and I will see you next week for our next graduate seminar. Thank you so much.